Well, welcome back. We're so glad you're here for our last lesson regarding the medieval church. If you have a Bible and you want to open up and follow along, I want to read a couple of verses from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 12, as sort of an introduction to this today. Luke chapter 12, beginning in verse 54, Jesus is talking to his detractors primarily, saying, you don't know how to discern the times. And he says this, then he also said to the multitudes, whenever you see a cloud rising out of the west, immediately you say a shower is coming, and so it is. And when you see the south wind blow, you say there will be hot weather, and there is. Hypocrites, you can discern the face of the sky and of the earth, but how is it that you do not discern this time or the times? As we're nearing the end of what historically we call the medieval period of church history, roughly from 500 to 1500, more specifically about 590 to 1517, we're talking about we're kind of on with our toes on the diving board, ready to jump in to the deep end of the Reformation. And so this is a transitional message. We're nearing the end of the medieval period, and we're approaching the modern period of the church, which is vast, even though it's much less in time. It's less in time, 500 years, as opposed to 1,000 years, but we'll take more time with it because more goes on. And the very beginning part of this modern church age is the Reformation. And I'm sure we're all aware the Reformation brought about and was part of a huge change, not only in the church, but in society. And as I've reminded you many times, people say, when did this happen? When did the church go astray here? None of this happens overnight. It takes long periods of time. It didn't happen overnight to go from the medieval period into the modern or Reformation period. And it didn't happen in a vacuum. There were many changes happening within the church, which those, of course, will give our greater interest to. But there were many changes happening societally, politically, outside of the church as well. And all of these were a part of God's providential plan to move forward with His plan for His church. So as we look at this chapter 25, the papacy faced external opposition. There was big changes in society. Big changes in society that were not necessarily anything to do with the church, and yet we would say obviously God providentially was in control of all of them. Society was changing. Society, which had been ruled by the church had the sort of the death grip, and I mean that literally, spiritually. The church had a death grip on society, imposed primarily by fear and intimidation. Well, the society was fixing to call the church's bluff. There were two societal changes that posed threats to the status quo that Rome depended upon, and we'll talk about those quickly as we make our way through this last section. The first is a cultural shift. It's a cultural shift known to history as the Renaissance. The Renaissance predates the Reformation, but it was also something that brought about, in many ways, from a human standpoint, brought about the Reformation. The Renaissance was a cultural prelude to the Reformation. The term means rebirth or born again, interestingly enough. This term was not used to describe this era until the mid-1800s. It's a term that people much later used to describe something that happened in history. People didn't say, oh, what's it like now that we're in the Renaissance? People weren't using those kinds of terms. But it does aptly describe what took place because there was a rebirth of society. And we'll talk just briefly about that. One main ingredient in this rebirth was the shift from a God-centered worldview to a man-centered worldview. The Renaissance people, I've got to be careful who I say here, but there are people, how about that? There are people who think the Renaissance was the greatest thing that happened. God used it in providence to bring about the Reformation, but the Renaissance was a grand shift away from belief in God and into what we would call today humanism. It was a time of optimism, but it was a time of humanistic opposition based on man's ability, man's greatness, rather than God's providence. Economically, the Renaissance was a time of prosperity for some. There actually was a middle class that emerged. That's not a bad thing. The middle class emerged largely because of the Renaissance. Whereas before, during the medieval period, there was more of a feudal system. You had the haves and the have-nots. And the have-nots were the worker bees, and there was lots of them. But now a middle class is emerging. One of the ways this happened is that people began to own land and not just be sharecroppers, although even if they were sharecroppers, they could actually begin to make a profit by selling what they grew. And people moved into trades and began to make a profit. Leonardo da Vinci and others explored the sciences and technology as never before during this period. One of the greatest inventions of all time, believe it or not, is the printing press that Mr. Gutenberg brought about. It revolutionized the world, according to some historians, more than any other invention in human history. Why? Because it was really the beginning of an information age. The first information age had nothing to do with the internet. It had to do with the printing press. Geographical exploration was taking place. European explorers were seeking to expand their domains and their areas of influence into the New World and into the Orient as never before. Columbus was a Renaissance man. He discovered the New World in 1482. We say discovered. Some people they take umbrage with that. Oh, he didn't discover it. There were already people here. Well, he discovered it from the standpoint of Western society in Europe. Obviously, the people who were native to the Americas already knew it was here. But this was the beginning of Europe knowing about the New World. Another thing that happened tremendously during the Renaissance period is art. And I am a lover of art. I will footnote that by saying real art, not what passes as art today. Just a little anecdote. It used to be if someone produced something that was artistic, people say, that guy's an artist. Now, any guy with a beret and some bongos says, I'm an artist, and any junk that he produces, oh, that must be art because an artist did it. But I digress. Michelangelo, one of the greatest artists of all time and of this particular time frame, created his masterpieces in this era. Interestingly enough, a lot of that being underwritten by the church, because the church had been taken over by the Medicis, and they were patrons of the arts. Prior to this, art was primarily religious in nature, and so was a lot of Michelangelo's work, but art during this period began to look at the creation instead of the creator. Now, that's not bad to enjoy the creation. Landscapes became something to look at in art, which is not a bad thing. Of course, it's bad if it's instead of the creator, which is where the humanistic part of it was happening. And the idea was to glorify man. If you study art history, which we're not going to do it in this, obviously, but it is fascinating to see how you can look at things and you can see how art changed, the focus of art changed based on when and where. And at this period, it became about man. I don't mean male, I mean mankind. It became about people instead about God and about His church. Art displayed the beauty of nature with very little regard for the God who created it, which is not too far from Romans chapter 1, is it? They worship the creature instead of the creator. The Renaissance influenced the papacy very much so. Many in the church were captivated by the arts, giving more attention to beautifying their world than to their spiritual duties. But the papacy, realizing what was going on, set out to do some things during the Renaissance as well. Pope Nicholas V, he lived from 1397 to 1455. He set out to rebuild the decaying infrastructure of Romanist churches. As we know, it doesn't matter how beautifully you build something, eventually it falls apart. And that was happening in Rome. Some of the beauty of Rome was starting to fall apart. Leo X, 1475 to 1521, in a move that was to influence more than architecture in the arts, sanctioned the sale for money, the sale of indulgences to raise money to build St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome. So here's something that says, oh, we're going to build, and we're going to beautify, we're going to build this great thing. But not only does everything eventually fall apart and need to be rebuilt and fixed and brought up to speed, but that costs money. And of course, the church needs money. And where does the church get money? By taxing people through fear and intimidation, saying, if you don't want to spend extra time, or if you don't want your family to spend extra time in purgatory, a place that doesn't exist, you give money and we'll get you and them out all the more. And of course, the poor people, they didn't know because they didn't have the Bible. They didn't have any idea. They only knew what the church told them, and they just assumed the church was telling them the truth. It was during this time that Lorenzo Valla exposed the donation of Constantine as a fraud. By the way, I just want to bring that up. It harkens back to something we've talked about a couple of other times. One of the ways the Roman Catholic Church justified its owning so much land and gathering so much wealth was because of this document called the Donation of Constantine. But it was during this time that it was exposed. This is a fraud. This is not a real document. We're basing something not only not on Scripture, but on some other document. And as it turns out, that it was a forgery and not really true. Why was it possible, listen carefully, why was it possible that the donation of Constantine, which is not a donation but a document that says it's okay, how did it come about that it could be exposed as a fraud? Because a new science was starting to emerge called textual criticism. Now, sometimes people get the problem in our modern day among Christians. People think textual criticism is evil. Textual criticism is not evil. What we might say is something to beware of as Christians is what some people call higher criticism, which is basically a criticism of the texts of the Bible with the intent of disproving them. And it's impossible because you can't disprove truth. But textual criticism is just studying ancient manuscripts and learning how to understand what it's about. So it was through the emergence of this science of textual criticism that the donation of Constantine was proven as a fraud, and in the long run, that scriptures are proven to be reliable. Now, why do we need them to be proven? We don't need them to be proven, but here's the good news. Even though our faith is based on faith, it is reasonable and it is true. And while everything about God cannot be proven, such as His existence, can you prove that in a test tube, in a laboratory, under a microscope? No, but the evidence supports it, and that's what happens with textual criticism. The Renaissance encouraged the state to become more pragmatic to the extent that some rejected all thought of moral absolutes. This is what happens with humanism. Pretty soon, man is the measure of all things, and we don't need we don't need no stinking badges around here. We don't need God to tell us what to do. We will be the measure of this. Humanism, man is the measure. An Italian statesman who is probably the epitome of this, I'm sure there may have been others, but the epitome of this was a fellow named Machiavelli, who was a sort of a political, cultural, social analyst and philosopher. He wrote that, quote, the ideal ruler must be absolute and, listen, and must use any means, listen, however unscrupulous and unethical, wow, and however much he may perjure the truth or break promises to protect the state. In other words, if you're a position of power and authority politically, you have the right to lie, cheat, steal, do whatever it takes to promote your political agenda. Now, I'm not going to name names. But some of you are laughing because we live in a day and age where there's certain people, certain groups of people within our political world who get a pass on everything. They can lie, they can cheat, they can steal, they can break laws, and everybody just goes, well, yeah. It's Machiavellian. Machiavellian means it's okay to do bad for the sake of good, and I'll determine what's good. Can you see that last part of that's very important? I'll say what's good, not what God says is good, because if we go with what God says is good, it's never right to do wrong. It is never okay to do bad for the sake of good. So this was happening in the state. This is a matter of pragmatism being taken to its total godless, anti-God extreme. This was also a time of increased study of the Bible, which of course for this we are very grateful. Many of those who did so were humanistic in their approach. They studied the Bible as literature. They studied it as a means to promote the best in mankind. People are still doing that today. They think the Bible's about us. The Bible's not about us. The Bible's about God. The Bible is about God. He's the hero of every story. Jesus Christ is the main character on every page of the Scripture. It's not about us. It's about God. These folks, instead of seeking access to God and seeking man's truth, and today the way we would say is that we psychologize the Scriptures and we turn them all into little moralistic stories to tell us how to have a better life, which is what passes for preaching in huge swaths of Christianity in our culture today. And this is when it began happening. The tendency to allegorize the Bible was still quite common. Yeah, no kidding. You have to do that. I listened to a message, I'm not going to go into the detail, but I listened to another message on the radio the other day as I was in the car driving from point A to point B, and there I am screaming at my dashboard. That's not what this text is all about. This allegedly Christian pastor, a part of a group of churches that people think are wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. He's preaching on Lazarus, and he says this story is in the Bible to teach us that we need to go out there and speak life into other people. We need to speak life into society and change society. No, it's about Jesus demonstrating He has authority over life and death as a prelude to raising Himself from the dead. Totally missing the point, but that's the kind of stuff that goes on and has been going on for a long time. The Bible is I say, God is the main character. It's about forgiveness of sin and reconciliation with God and growth in holiness. It's not about, let's preserve society and we'll use the Bible as our way to do that. We got to be careful because many people we might want to associate ourselves with wrap the cross in the flag and try to turn Americanism and Christianity into synonyms, and they're not, especially since we have a tendency nowadays to be much more Machiavellian. We're willing to do bad things for the sake of good in the name of God. Wrong, 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 wrong.